I'm ready. Yeah, I'm ready. I'm just. Are you talking to him? Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Firstly, welcome to GDSC at Heriot-Watt. Thank you for attending to everyone in person as well as online. Let me start by introducing myself. I am Gaurav Gosain. I am a recent graduate, graduated with a BSc honors in artificial intelligence, computer science. I'm also a part of the core team at GDSC, Heriot-Watt. So before we start, if you would like to follow along when we move to the coding section of today's session, you could scan the QR code or you could visit the link given here. It links you to the GitHub repository with the starter code for Firebase authentication along with Material UI and Tailwind CSS setup out of the box. You can scroll down to the readme.md part of the repository to look at the steps of how to initialize the repository, install the dependencies of the repository, and so on. Okay, so today's agenda, we start off by a short recap of what we covered so far. Then we move on to routing. What is routing basically? How does Next.js handle routing? What are different forms of routing in Next.js? This is followed by a short introduction to what APIs are. Then we follow that by going into what Firebase is, what services Firebase provides us with, including authentication as well as Cloud Firestore. But today we'll mostly be covering the authentication part of Firebase. This will be followed by a short break, a 10-minute break. And finally, we move on to actually setting up a web app in Firebase as well as live coding. So before we move on, let's have a small recap of what's already done. We discussed this earlier. There are three basic foundations of web technologies. The front end basically is made of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. What happens when a user visits a web page? The HTML is basically converted into something called a DOM. It's a tree-like structure which basically describes what the HTML page is to the browser so that it can render it out to the user. This is followed by what we looked at about components. Basically, components are breaking down your code into smaller segments so that you can basically join them up like Lego, so you can build up bigger components. We then also discussed how Next.js works in the backend, what it does when you actually compile your code. So the code gets compiled into pure JavaScript, since your browser cannot understand JSX, which is what you use to write in React. It converts that into pure JavaScript. So that's what the compiler part does. That's followed by minifying. Minifying is basically shortening down your code, removing unnecessary parts of your code. This is then followed by bundling, which is basically putting together all the different minified parts of your code base into a single file. And since this single file is too big to be sent to the user as one thing, it is split into smaller chunks, which is called splitting, code splitting, basically. We also looked at what kinds of rendering methods does Next.js support. So there are two major types of rendering with React or Next.js. In this case, that is client-side rendering and pre-rendering. We looked at client-side rendering to be something that displays an empty web page when the user first loads in, and then the content is loaded when JavaScript is loaded onto the browser. Whereas pre-rendering sort of loads a skeleton of an HTML page when the user first lands on the page, and then later makes the page more interactive when JavaScript fully loads in. This process we discussed was called hydration. There were two main types of pre-rendering that Next.js offers us. The first one is static site generation, which is basically generating static pages in advance so that when a user requests for a new page, the page is loaded very quick. The other type was server-side rendering, which is basically your code runs on a server, it generates an HTML page, and that HTML page is sent to your user when a user requests for a new page. We also discussed what the network was. We discussed different types of networks, what servers are basically. We discussed there were origin servers, which are the basic form of servers. We discussed what CDNs were, or content delivery networks, which are a way to cache your data or store your data onto different devices spread across different geographical locations. You can store static files like HTML pages and images on CDNs, which can basically be requested by the user, and they're loaded on faster than it would have been loaded if it was just requested by an origin server. And we also discussed what the edge is. It's a more relatively newer technology that's not fully implemented in Next.js, but we discussed how it can revolutionize the way that pages are loaded. Uh, the edge is basically very similar to CDNs. The only difference being that it can even run code, which means that you can have server-side components that can render on the fly on the server and can be sent directly to the user, which can save a lot of processing time on the origin server. We also discussed what kind of front-end tooling can be used. We are basically using Material UI, which is a UI component library. It has different components that are pre-built with certain settings you can change to change the look and feel of the components. It follows the Material design, which is Google's design language. Tailwind CSS is another styling library. It helps us to add CSS styles using class names. Um, Now let's move on to the new topic we'll be covering today. What is routing? So routing in very simple words is the process of keeping the user interface in sync with the URL. Routing refers to the process of navigating a website. So it's not always necessary that your website will have a single page. You might have noticed that if you visit a website, they have multiple pages. For example, they have like an about page, a contact page. So navigating to these pages is the process of routing. Um, in Next.js, so far, whatever we have done, we have just been working on the root of the website or like the index page where the user lands. In today's session, we'll be looking at different routes, how we can create routes, how we can manipulate routes, how you can have dynamic routes so that the user can visit a dynamic route and still be served content that is relevant to the route. As we discussed, routes can be, for example, /about on a website. When someone visits /about, they'll get content that's relevant to /about, basically describing what the website is about. There can be a contact us page where a user can be presented with a form which he can fill out, which is then sent on to the website's owner through a backend. So to move on, before we actually explore what routing options Next.js provides us, it is important to understand what pages are in Next.js. So any file basically that you create under the pages directory or a pages folder inside a Next.js project is considered a page in Next.js. It's pretty straightforward to understand. A page can be a JavaScript or a TypeScript file. So you can see the 4 extensions that Next.js supports by default. JS standing for JavaScript, JSX is the language that React uses. TS stands for TypeScript, and TSX is a JSX variant that TypeScript supports. So a page basically has a single component, a React component that is rendered out as a function, and it is returned or exported as a default value. So any default value that is exported in a Next.js page is then rendered out on that route. So for example, we can have a file, the example you can see here, you can have a file called about.js that can be present inside the pages folder. We can create a new file, and you can export a simple React component. So for example, in that example, you can see there is a function about that has a div. A div is a enclosing tag, and it has the text about inside it. And the last line basically exports the about function that we just created. So what the export statement does is lets Next.js know that we are going to use that particular function as our main component when someone visits the /about page on our website. So for example, say our website was www.example.com, for example. So if someone visits example.com/about, he will be greeted with just about on as a div. So routing in Next.js, basically Next.js has routing that is based on the file structure. It's a file-based routing system. Now what that means is, as we saw in the example before, you can create a file inside the pages directory or a pages folder, for example. So you can say create about.js inside pages. And whenever a user visits the /about endpoint of a website, he's greeted with whatever is exported as a default value inside the file you've just created. So the pattern that Next.js follows is very interesting. When you consider routing, when you want to do routing by default in React, you would have to import another library called React Router, basically understand how the React Router syntax works, define your own routes. But in Next.js, you can simply create a new file, and whatever the name of the file is, a route with that particular name is just created on your website by default. Um, Now index routes, what index routes are. So we have seen the first example in our previous coding session. So whatever we wrote in the /index.js page is basically the main page, the root of your project, gets rendered out at slash. Slash is basically just the basic default entry point of any website. So basically, when you go on google.com or any other website, by default, whatever is rendered is called the index page. Now, what Next.js supports is folders inside the pages directory, which means you can have nested routes. What that means is basically you can have routes at multiple levels. You can have something at /blog, for example. So you want to have a blog page, you can simply create a blog folder, and inside the blog folder you can have an index.js file, and whatever is exported in the index.js file gets rendered on the /blog endpoint of your website. Don't worry, we'll be covering this more in detail later. So this is a small detail to know. There are alternate ways of naming. The convention can change depending on your use case. So for example, to create an endpoint /blog, you can do that in two ways. The first way is what we looked at in the previous slide, that is just create a blog folder and then create an index.js page inside the blog folder. That does the same thing as just creating a blog.js file. So you can just create a blog.js file inside your pages directory, and whenever you visit /blog on your website, whatever is exported in the blog.js file, that gets rendered out. So what are nested routes? Nested routes with Next.js, it is also possible to create nested routes. This is actually pretty easy. You can just visualize it. For example, you can have folders inside folders, and whatever the name of the folder is, that becomes a part of the URL. So for example, if you have a dashboard folder and you have settings inside the dashboard folder. So you have a folder inside a folder. Basically, dashboard is your root folder. You have settings as another folder inside that. And if you create a username.js file inside the subfolder, it basically creates another endpoint for you, that is dashboard/settings/username. So if you have this sort of subfolder structure in your pages directory, and if a user visits that particular URL, that is /dashboard/settings/username, he will be presented with whatever is returned in your username.js file inside the subfolder nesting. So what are dynamic routes? What's cool with Next.js is that you can even define dynamic routes. It's not always necessary that you will know what route you want to set. Let's take a simple example. You have made your blogging website. You create a new blog. You're not sure beforehand, like you can't predict what you're going to name your blog, right? You can't have a preset name for every blog you're going to write in the future. So how you can solve that is using dynamic blogs. Dynamic routes, sorry. So what dynamic routes, the syntax for dynamic routes is pretty simple. Whatever you put in the square brackets. So you can create a new file in your pages directory. You can create a subfolder. For example, over here we have a blog folder inside the pages directory. So now, for example, if you create a new file with a particular name, a very specific name, the name should follow this particular syntax. So whatever you have, the words inside the square brackets don't really matter, but it should be a single word. So anything inside the square brackets is treated as a dynamic route. What that means is basically if anyone visits /blog/hello world, for example, although we have not explicitly defined hello world as a file in our system, but what Next.js does behind the scenes is it matches the URL and it checks if there is a similar pattern that we have defined as a dynamic route. And if it finds that pattern, it basically just goes to that the file with the square brackets and checks if that is exporting something. If that's exporting something, that is rendered out to the user. Now, you can even have dynamic routes, like the middle part of a route can also be dynamic. For example, you can see Over there, there's the second example. The second bullet point is basically an example where the folder name can also have the square brackets. When a folder name has square brackets, it means that the everything falling under that folder, all pages, will have a dynamic parent, but the whatever is inside can either be static or dynamic. Now, what the last one does is it's a very different syntax. There are three dots in front of whatever name you give to the dynamic component. What that does is it's a very wildcard pattern. It's basically it matches anything after the post. So basically, in that example, if you have post slash dot 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 all dot js, uh, anything with a slash post in front of it gets matched to that very component. So whenever someone visits, say, example slash post slash 2020, if he just stops there, even then, if it doesn't have a specific file with 2020.js as its name, it will default to going back and checking for a dynamic route. So one interesting thing to note about routing in Next.js is that static routes are given preference over dynamic routes. So for example, you can take the first one, for example, you have pages slash blog slash slug.js. For example, we go to slash blog slash hello world. That will by default go to slug.js, but that is not the case when we have a specified file already inside the blog folder. So if we have an hello world.js file inside the blog folder, it doesn't default to going to the slug.js file to check for what should be rendered, but then it goes to the static file. If we have created a hello world.js file, for example, it will go to that instead of checking for the dynamic file first. So now, why dynamic routes? Defining routes by using predefined paths is not always enough. For some complex interactions, like if you have a social media app, for example, if some user posts something, you can't predict that they're going to post something at a particular URL, or you can't predict if they're going to give a particular title to their post. So for that reason, we need dynamic routes so that we can pattern match and render out URLs that we are not sure if a user can visit or not. Yeah, so we checked out the syntax. The syntax is basically just adding square brackets in front of the file name that creates a dynamic route for you. They're also known as URL slugs or pretty URLs. Yeah, so this is a basic example of what happens if you create a dynamic route. So this code snippet here shows you what you can put inside pid.js. PID is just a random name. You can put anything inside the square brackets, by the way. It's just whatever variable name you would like to give your dynamic route. That's what you put inside the square brackets. So suppose you have a square bracket pid.js file inside the post directory, inside your pages directory. So this is a basic example where we use use router, which is basically a hook that Next.js provides us by default. Now, what a hook is basically a higher level component that you can use to get some value out. This is pre-implemented by Next.js, so we don't have to deal with actually checking the routes ourselves and figuring out anything. So all you have to do is import the use router as it's given in the slide. Then you have your basic post component. So this is an arrow function. If you're not aware, an arrow function is very similar to the function we saw before. It just uses a different syntax. Then we use the use router hook that we just imported on top. Whatever the return value of the use router hook, we store that in a constant called router. And basically, what the router gives us is access to something called query. So what query is basically whatever your route has in its URL that can be represented in an object structure. So what the object structure does is, so suppose you're visiting a dynamic URL called post slash suppose 1 or 2 or something. So what Next.js by default will do for you is set PID as the key and 1 as the value. So whatever is in your URL is set as a value to the key of whatever the name of your file is, and that is sent back by default as the query parameter. So when you say router.query, it will return you an object with a key and value pair. So the key is basically the name of your file, and the value is whatever the URL the person is currently visiting. And the return statement is basically just using JavaScript inside JSX. So the curly brackets you see there is a way of using JavaScript variables inside HTML like JSX components. So what it's doing there is basically returning post colon and whatever the name of the post is. That's a very simple example of a dynamic routed component. So here are a few examples. So if someone visits post/1 or post/abc, etc., what happens is it will be matched by default by next router to the file we had created for the dynamic route, which is pid.js. So let's see the first example. For example, someone visits /post/abc. So what the router.query object will return to us will be an object of that sort. So it will have PID, and the value for the PID will be ABC because we are visiting the /ABC endpoint of the post URL. Similarly, you can have query parameters like normal URL query parameters. These have a very simple syntax. You just put a question mark after the route. You give a variable name and the value of the variable name. Now, what the second example, that is /post/abc question mark foo equals bar, what that does is it returns two things inside the object instead of one. Now, since we have an extra query that we are putting in the URL, it will return two values. So basically foo, that is foo equals bar. So that's the same thing that gets set and that gets set in the object. And similar to the previous example, we even get the PID value, which is ABC again in this example. Now you can even have multiple dynamic routes. You can even nest dynamic routes. You might not come across a use case for this, but it can be useful in some complex scenarios. So for example, that pages/post/pid/comment.js is another file you can create. Notice that PID and comment are both in square brackets, which means they are both dynamic. So you're nesting a dynamic route inside a dynamic route. So suppose someone visits /post/abc/a comment, for example. So this is the object that will be returned. You can see it on screen. PID, again, it's ABC since we are visiting /post/abc. Now, say if you were visiting /post/def, for example, instead of PID being ABC, it will be def. So it corresponds to whatever URL you are currently visiting. And the second dynamic part was comment.js. So you can see it gives us an object that is comment, and the value for the comment, whatever the URL match will return. So routing in Next.js, it's pretty straightforward. It's a file-based system. You can create folders. You can create sub-routes, basically. Any file inside the folder will get a complete URL with the folder name / whatever the file name is on your website. Next.js handles everything from creating the route to publishing it. All the routing that is done in Next.js is basically client-side. It uses JavaScript to change the URL and the content. So we had discussed what hydration was before. So what happens when Next.js changes a route is basically it rehydrates the page, basically sends a HTML file first and then loads up the interactive parts later. So as you can see in the small code snippet here, Next.js also provides us with a component that handles routing for us. We can import the component like import link from next/link. Next/link is a default library that comes when you install Next.js. So all you have to do is just create an anchor tag, which is basically an A tag and a HTML tag, and you have to basically wrap the anchor tag with the link component that Next.js provides you with, and you have to set a single property to the link component, that is href or hypertext reference. So if you set href to say /post/abc, for example, and if someone clicks on that particular link, your user gets redirected automatically to /post/abc on your website. So the good thing about React and Next.js in general, compared to normal, like if you just make an HTML page and if you want to link to another HTML page, what your browser does is basically fetches the new HTML page, refreshes your whole page. So there is a complete refresh in your page when you switch between different routes on the same website. What Next.js does is eliminates the need for this. So what it does is it uses JavaScript. It's client-side rendering, so there is no need to refresh the page every time. So you'll notice whenever you change links or routes within a Next.js app, there is no refresh that's happening between the consequent changes in the URL. The user interface just updates nicely and just stays in sync with whatever URL you're on currently. So, so far, whatever we have discussed is declarative routing. Declarative routing is basically having a particular component that's rendered out in your UI that handles all the functionality for changing the routes. Now, although you will almost never need declarative routing using the APIs provided by Next/Link, it's a good to know thing. You might end up in certain use cases. For example, we'll even see in the example we covered today, you might need a programmatic way or a programmatic approach to change the link without the use of a link component that's provided by Next/Link. So you can see a very basic example over here. As before, you've seen the use router hook. We used it in the query parameter when we were discussing dynamic routes. The way to use use router is very similar in this case as well. You just call the use router hook. It returns a value. You store that value in a constant. We just choose to name it router. You can name it whatever you want. So const router equals use router will basically give us access to all the underlying APIs that are provided by Next/Link. One of the functions that this router API provides us is dot push. Dot push, basically what it does is it pushes a particular URL link onto your browser's URL. So if you say dot push slash about and say you're on the home page of a website and someone clicks on a button, on click we are first firing an event or a function in this case. So this function simply calls router.push and passes slash about as whatever link we want to visit. So what this does is basically does the same thing as what would happen if we wrap this component with a link component and set the hypertext reference to slash about. It's the same thing, but here we are doing it programmatically instead of actually having a wrapper link element that's provided by Next.js. So now let's have a short introduction to APIs. This is important before we move to Firebase, since most of the interaction with Firebase is based on APIs. So what are APIs? API stands for Application Programming Interface or interfaces. They are constructs made available in programming languages to allow developers to create complex functionality more easily. So what APIs help us to do is they help us separate the complex parts of your code and make it accessible to you via simple commands, basically. Okay, to visualize APIs, a real world example, you could think of an electricity supply in your house. So when you want to power something, you don't directly plug in whatever you want into the wall directly into the wires, right? You use a socket. So the socket in our case can be considered an API. So it's a middleware sort of thing. It's a thing that interacts with the front end and the back end and glues them together. This is another example you can look at. So basically, let's take a restaurant for example. You have the chefs who cook. You can consider that as your backend. You have you yourself as a guest. If you're dining over there, you can be considered as the front end. And then there are waiters who can be considered as an API. So they take your order, they take it to the backend. The chefs prepare something that is basically the results in your backend. They'll send it back via the waiter to the front end. That is you. So that's a very simple way of visualizing what an API is, how it links or joins the backend to your front end. It is important to know that mostly when you deal with APIs, they will return you results in the form of a JSON file or a JSON format. What JSON stands for is JavaScript Object Notation, or it's basically very similar to creating dictionaries. If you're aware what a dictionary is, it is a key value pair, something that has a name and whatever value the name holds. Now let's move on to Firebase. Firebase is we'll not only use Firebase for authentication, we'll also use it to store our data using Cloud Firestore, as well as there is Firebase storage where you can host images basically. So let's move on to who uses Firebase. So Firebase is basically backed by Google. Millions of developers use it, all the way from very small family businesses to mega corporations. You can see New York Times, Trivago, just to give a few examples. You can read more about Firebase. We'll be discussing more, but if you want to just read for yourself, you can visit firebase.google.com. They have excellent documentation. They provide you step-by-step instructions on how to integrate Firebase with whatever platform you're using, whatever app you're developing. The good thing about Firebase is you can integrate it with web applications, you can integrate it with mobile applications. Recently, I think they've even added support for Unity, and uh, yeah, so you can use Firebase in pretty much any application you would think possible. Um, so what is Firebase? Here we'll cover a basic overview of what Firebase is. It is a mobile and web application platform. It provides us with tools and infrastructure which is designed to help us as developers to build high quality applications. As I said before, it is backed by Google and it is trusted by millions of businesses around the world. It provides us a variety of tools that you can use in your application. For example, in this session, we'll mostly be covering Firebase Auth, which is their authentication service, where you can authenticate users and store them somewhere. So you know if a user visits your website twice, you'll know that he logged in before. For this session, we'll mostly be using login with Google, but Firebase provides us with a lot more options when it comes to authentication. We'll come to that later. So why Firebase? It also helps us create applications without knowing any server-side coding. So it provides us a backend as a service. What that means is you can interact with Firebase without actually hosting your own server or without actually knowing how to link your server with the front end. So that's a plus with Firebase. Now, few interesting facts about Firebase. It was founded in 2011 by Andrew Lee and James Tamplin. Uh, to start off with, it was not a Google project. It was later acquired by Google. The initial product they launched with was a real-time database. Fun fact, it's still a part of the suite. Like the real-time database is still part of Firebase, and it's a very easy to use backend service. Over time, they added a lot of tools to their complete variety of tools. It was acquired by Google in 2014. Yeah, so Firebase is good for all major aspects of web development or even application development in general. So you can use the same backend if you have an app that requires a mobile application as well as a website. Firebase is the perfect option as you can use it for both. Um, they support everything all the way from building your app to releasing it, even monitoring it. And you can even monetize your apps later if you want to integrate Firebase with AdSense, you can totally do that. Okay, so traditionally, what app development looked like is this. You would have a database, you would have a server, and your client or a device, basically. Firstly, you would have to rent a server or own one. If you're very rich, you would own one. This server needs to be running all the time, 24/7. Um, you would have to create a database. You would have to basically make your database talk to your server, your client talk to your server, and somehow link them both using an API. Or you could use a language such as Express to link them. What Firebase does for you is it eliminates the need of the server. So they provide you with a Firebase SDK. SDK stands for Software Development Kit, if you didn't know. Um, it basically acts as an API. It's not exactly an API, but the functionality is pretty similar. So what it does is it bridges the gap between the actual database or storage or whatever you have in the backend with a link to Firebase, and it will link that to the front end so that the data can be provided to your user when it's requested. They have a lot of services, as I discussed before. They have Cloud Firestore, which is their flagship database backend service. They have Firebase Auth, which is their authentication service. They have file storage. Um, yeah, so these are the primitives: Firestore, authentication, and storage. Uh, so for today's session, we'll mostly be discussing what Firebase Auth is, how you can use it, how you can integrate it in your Next.js app, and how you can authenticate users with sign-in with Google. So what's really cool about Firebase is that when a user logs in, it will give your user a particular authentication ID or UID, a unique ID. So one user has a particular unique ID linked to all the services they want to log in with. So a user with Firebase authentication can log in with multiple different services. So if a user wants to have their account linked with Facebook and Google at the same time, they can totally do that. Since Firebase gives a unique ID, uh, your application will always know that the same person has logged in, even if they log in with different services at different times. Um, so now let's talk about a few benefits what Firebase Auth provides us with. It's simple to learn. It provides us with multi-platform sign-in. So Firebase authentication has multiple sign-in options, as we saw in the previous slide. You can have GitHub, you can have Facebook, you can have Google, you can have an email password authentication, for example. Um, yeah, so for the end users, it provides an end-to-end identity solution. What that means is it's secure. It uses OAuth 2, which is basically a very secure way of logging in into some application. Um, so by Firebase Auth, again, it provides you with a simple Firebase UI plugin. You can basically just install this plugin and drop a login flow into your application. Uh, Although we don't use this for the purposes of our demo, since Firebase UI has not been updated for the current version of React and is incompatible. Um, Now, why is it good for security as well? It is built by the team at Google. They know what their security is. They're pretty good at it. Um, yeah, it's fast as well. You can implement authentication pretty quick. Uh, it can take months to set up your own authentication service. If you want to set up your own authentication service, it requires a complete team, people who take care of the authentication service, make sure that it's bug free. But with Firebase Auth, the Google team looks after it. You just have to import it and just use a few lines of code to interact with it. Uh, Another advantage it provides you with is you can have advanced features with Google Cloud services or Google Cloud Identity Platform. You can have multi advanced features like multi-factor authentication or enterprise SLAs or blocking functions, which are very hard to implement on your own. But with the help of Firebase Auth, it is pretty simple to integrate these extra features into your app. So following this, let's just have a short 10-minute break. Uh, Followed by the break, we'll start setting up our Firebase app and actually coding something in Next.js. Any questions? Okay, so for the coding part, you can scan this QR code or visit this URL, and you'll be redirected to the GitHub repository that we'll be using for the coding part. So what the GitHub repository looks like is something like this. So if you have a GitHub account and you're already logged in, you should see use this template. If not, you can directly click on the code and download the code as a zip file. Since I have an account, I'll click on use this template. Let's call it Next.js auth demo. Make it public, and checking on that should create your repository on your very own domain, so you can clone it basically. So how you clone it is click on the code section, click copy the URL, and basically if you have Git installed on your system, you can first navigate to whatever folder you want to navigate or wherever you want to save the file to. And you can run one simple command, git clone followed by whatever link you just copied. So running that should clone the repository under whatever folder you selected here. Now you can cd into the repository by cd and the name of the folder, and you can open it, and finally you can open it in VS Code by typing code space dot. So that should open the template repository. So the first step you would want to do is, before you do anything with the repository, first install all the npm packages. That can be done using the command npm install. So npm install should run and install all the required packages for you. So while that's running, let's set up our Firebase project. How we can do that is basically just searching console.firebase.google.com. So that should take you to a screen that looks something similar to this. If you do not have any projects, I think it just shows create a new project in the center. If you already have a project, you can still create more projects. What a project in Firebase is a cumulative place where you can interact with all the services provided by Firebase. So you can give it a name, whatever name you like. So Next.js demo, for example. This is optional. This is up to you if you want to turn on analytics or not. I will turn it off for this tutorial. And yeah, that should initialize your Firebase app. Should be pretty quick. Yep, there we go. So it created your Firebase project. You can click on continue and it will take you to the single place where you can interact with everything in your Firebase project. So the first thing you would want to do is head over to this web icon. You can see it on the landing page once you have created. So what this does is creates a web app for you. You can give your web app a name that can help you identify it later. So I'll just call it Next.js auth, for example, for now. The Firebase hosting is optional. You can set it up later, so it's fine if you don't check it right now. You can click on register. So that will register the app for you. Now, in the template repository, Firebase was already installed, so you can skip the first step. What this page now gives you is the keys required for you to authorize yourself as the same user that's using these credentials in your app. So it basically gives you a Firebase config variable. Now you can head over to the code that you just cloned, and you will basically see that you have multiple files over here. So one of the files is labeled .env.local.example. This is the file we'll be editing. So you can see that they have the file has particular keys over here, and you have to set the values for these keys. So what you can do is basically uh, head over here. See, there's the API key. You can just copy the API key. And you can paste it over here. In a similar way, you can copy the auth domain, which is basically where your app will be hosted. And you can paste it to the corresponding auth domain key over here. Similarly, there is a project ID. You can copy here and paste it here. There is storage bucket, which we won't be using right now, but we might need it later when you want to store images. There, messaging, I don't think we'll be using, but still, let's just put the key. And app ID. Now, I don't think we have a measurement ID over here. So what you can do is just remove that part. And the final step into creating this environment file so that your Next.js project can read it is renaming it. So basically just remove the .example from the end of the file. So what this does is lets Next.js know that these are the environment variables that you'll be using. So now let's see what the code base already has by default in the template repository. So if you head over to components, and inside components you have an auth folder, and inside auth you have a config.js file. Now I think we didn't have one of the config variables, right? So we can just remove that from here as well. I think it's already removed. So all you have to do is yeah. So Firebase auth, this is the main file that deals with the setting up Firebase auth, basically how to interact with Firebase auth. Initialize app is a function that Firebase provides by default that simply says that use the configuration that we defined, basically the keys that we got from just setting up Firebase, and initialize the app with those configurations so that Firebase knows that we are the ones using this database or the services for Firebase. Auth get auth is a function, another function Firebase provides us. It's from the Firebase/auth library. Basically says that we'll be using authentication in our app. Firestore is the cloud Firestore database that I mentioned before. It's a database that can be used to store data. So we initialize our database over here as such, and then finally we just export all three at the bottom of our file. So config.js was basically just mapping everything in our environment to the actual keys. And in our Firebase auth.js, we simply pass on that config to our Firebase to our initialize app function that's provided by Firebase to initialize our app. Now, if we look at the pages folder, so as we discussed today with routing, the pages folder is where everything in Next.js happens, all the routing happens. So index.js is the default page where the user lands by default. For our auth template, we have made some changes. So for example, underscore app.js is another primitive file that Next.js provides us with. So what underscore app.js is basically defines the layout that your Next.js app will follow throughout. By default, it only comes with the component and page props that are passed as props to the my app function. That's the main function. And we basically export a component with those particular page props. In our case, we have even defined a use effect hook. A use effect hook is something that React provides us with. A use effect takes two arguments. The first one is a function that it needs to run, and the second one is a dependency array. So what the dependency array is basically it takes a bunch of different variables. And based on these variables, if any of these variables change, the function inside the use effect is run again on every change of any of the variables in the dependency array. So suppose we had more dependencies, say uh, DEP1 or DEP2, which we don't have right now. Just for an example, you could do something like this, where the array has three things, and anytime either one of these three change, the function that is passed in to the use effect, that is this piece of code, is run again. So for now, let's just go back to using user as our sole dependency over here. And let's look at the function that the use effect is running. So what it's doing is uh, when so use auth state is something that we get from React Firebase hooks. So React Firebase hooks is an excellent library that simplifies some of the API interactions with the Firebase services. It provides us with some basic definitions. So I can just show that to you. So you can just visit GitHub, React Firebase hooks. So they provide you certain functions that are predefined for all Firebase services. So for example, there are hooks specific to authentication. There are hooks that work for Firestore. You can use that for cloud functions. You can use for messaging, storage, real-time database, or whatever. So you can click on either one of these, and it should open up some documentation for that. So you can see that these are all the functions that React Firebase hook provides us with. For this tutorial, we won't be dealing with any other authentication service other than Google. So all that matters to us right now is just use auth state, which is a general hook that if a user is logged into your app, this hook will provide you with the details of the user, or if the user is in another state. So for example, if the user is loading, or if the user has an error state, uh, this hook that is a custom hook defined in this library provides us with all that information. Another hook that we'll be using from this library is called use sign in with Google, which is basically very similar to use auth state. The only difference is it also provides us with a function that can be used to sign in with Google. So you can actually click on use sign in with Google, and you can see it's a function, somewhat like a function that takes in a value. So this auth is the Firebase authentication that we had defined already in our Firebase.js file inside our components folder. Um, and yeah, it returns us with an array of things. So the first one being the function that can be used to sign in someone with Google. The second one is the user, the actual user that you get after the person has signed in and successfully authenticated. The third value that you get is a loading state, which is basically when the user clicks on the button and is on the pop-up view for signing in. That's when the loading state gets set to true. And another state is an error state. For example, if something goes wrong while signing in, the error state gets populated with an error message and some extra details. So we basically use the use auth state hook that we just discussed. We get the user value from the use auth state. And if you read the documentation, it says whenever the user is not logged in, the value for this user variable that we're getting from this hook is set to null by default. Null is like a JavaScript value. So in the function for our use effect, as we were discussing before, we are using an if condition. So we are basically checking if the user is null. So what we are saying here is if the user is not logged in, we just use the router. So we discussed in the slides as well, use router is a hook that's provided by Next/router. We can use that to get the router value that's returned, which we can then use to interact with other APIs like .push or .query, for example. So over here, we use the router value to imperatively push the /login page. Um, the else part of the condition just says if the user is authenticated, basically if user holds some kind of value, then what we can do is so the following lines are basically using Cloud Firestore. You don't need to really understand what's happening over here. But in very simple terms, what it is doing is if the user exists or if the user just logged in, you can select a document with a particular UID or user ID that is very specific to the user. It's unique for every user. So you can select a particular document with a unique ID, and you can basically set values for that document. So anything that's stored in a Firestore database is called a document, and a collection of documents is called a collection. So in this very simple example, we are selecting a database, we are selecting the collection called users, and then we are selecting a document with with the user's unique ID or UID in that particular instance of the collection, and we are setting a new document with certain properties. For example, we are setting the display name as user.displayname, as the email as user.email. Photo URL is basically the image provided by Google. So if you have an image on your Google account, that's what the photo URL stores. So you're saving that. And UID again is the unique user ID that's provided by Firebase when a user authenticates. So this UID is specific to every user. So it's different for every user when they log in. And then we pass another parameter into the setDoc function, which basically says merge true. So if the user already exists, it doesn't create an extra document with the same user ID, but just merges it with the already existing document. So now in the if part of the condition, we saw if a user lands on the on the root page, on the index page, and if the user is not logged in, it basically redirects you to the /login, which is login.js in your pages directory. Um, so now what login.js does is we are using the other hook we just saw on the React Firebase hooks, that is you sign in with Google, which takes this auth, which we are directly importing from the custom Firebase auth.js definition we had done above. In the firebase.auth.js, we had something called auth, which was defined as the return value of get auth, and we were passing in our app. So this is the same value we use in login.js, and we pass into the you sign in with Google function. So what this returns to us is an array of different values we can use. So there is sign in with Google, which is a function which we can use to start to basically start a sign in flow, or like to start a pop-up that shows you different options for choosing your Google account. The second value is basically user. The only difference between the previous hook that we used in index.js, that is use auth state, and the one we are using currently, that is use sign in with Google, is that when a user is undefined, in the other hook, the user gets turned into null. But in this hook, the user, when it's undefined, is actually set to the value called undefined in JavaScript. Um, okay, so then we go on to define a custom function, basically an arrow function that returns different values based on different states. So if the user is in a loading state, basically if they have clicked on the button for sign in and they are in the process of signing in, we return a certain value. So circular progress is a UI component that's provided to us with material UI. Um, the second value that the second if condition that we can see is if error. So if there is an error, we are basically just returning the error message for now. The third value, the third if condition that we see, if the user is undefined, basically if the user has not signed in, we display a separate button. So what this button is basically just showing sign in with Google. Um, with the start icon. So start icon is something that Material UI provides us with when we are setting a button. A start icon is something that's put at the start of a button. So we are just saying set the start icon as a Google icon. And on click, basically when a user clicks on the button, we just call the sign in with Google function that was defined, that we found that we were uh, defining over here with the you sign in with Google prop, sorry, hook. And this is just some extra CSS that you don't really need to know. It's basically just uh, a div with an image and another div with an image followed by a login button. So this login button is the custom function we defined above. So based on the state of the user's current authentication status, a different value is returned. So before we actually get the app working with Firebase authentication, we need to do a couple of more steps. So you can click on continue to console here. You can head over to the build. On the left hand side, you can see build. Under build, there will be authentication. So this is what we'll be using right now. So if you head over to authentication, and if it's your first time visiting this page, you would see something like get started over here. So you can just click on get started, and that should enable authentication for you. Now you can see there are different ways of authenticating a user. You can use an email, password, login, a phone number. There's even an anonymous login. You can and the additional providers, you have Google, Facebook, Play Games, Game Center, and so on. For today's example, to keep it simple, we'll just be using Google sign-in. So you can go ahead, click on the Google sign-in thing and enable it. You can give it a public-facing name, just Next.js demo, for example. Uh, and you just select an email that's associated with your Firebase account. That's it. You can just click on save, and that should save it. Now, if you had noticed in the code, we even had the set doc function, which is basically something that we get with Cloud Firestore. So we also had enabled Cloud Firestore. So what we'll have to do is head over to Firestore database. Again, if you're viewing this page for the first time, you'll see this button, create database. We can start in test mode since we are still not deploying the application. And then you can choose your server, whatever server you think is the closest to you. I'll keep it to the default one, and you can enable it. So what that does is it creates an instance of a database somewhere in Google servers, so that you can store data on it. So let it initialize the database now. Okay, so that's done. Uh, Now, an important thing to note here is under authentication. Um, I think under project overview. Yeah, so it's important to check if Google over here shows enabled. If it's not enabled, you need to enable the Google Auth again, just to confirm that everything works. So now since we can head back to our code editor, and since we have enabled authentication as well as Firestore database, what we can do is run the command npm run dev, which should spin up a development server for us. So that starts a development server at localhost 3000. So you can simply copy this URL, http:// localhost 3000. You can head over to your browser and basically just open the URL. And if all went well, hopefully it should display a login page to you. So there you go. So you have a login page with a simple sign in with Google button that we had defined earlier. So since the user is not authenticated right now, we have a sign in with Google button over there, which we can click, and it should open up a new tab with where you can select whatever account you want to log in with. You can click the account you want to log in with, and it should redirect you back to the website. And if you're logged in successfully, it should then render this some details out for you. So it's printing out very basic details over here. So you're getting your name, you're getting your email ID, you're getting your unique UID, and it should have displayed the picture as well. I'm not sure why it doesn't. Let me just refresh. Okay, anyways, so you get this very basic template that just enables you to sign in and sign out. So how the sign out is done, I can explain that in the index.js page. This is where all the logic for your landing page stays in. So again, you have your use auth state, which is the hook we discussed before. You have your router, which we discussed again before. It's the return value of the use router hook. We define a very basic function that's called sign out from app, which uses a sign out function. Now, where the sign out function is coming from is the Firebase/auth library. So it provides you with a sign out function, which you can just pass in the auth variable that you got from firebase.js, and it should log you out. And then on successful logout, all we do is just push to the router the login page again. And now again, we do some checking over here. So if user is null, we don't return anything. If the user is defined, we basically return a div. So what this motion.div is basically just an extension of a library. So we're using Framer Motion. It's a library that helps us animate things or like add basic CSS animations to our website. So you can use any primitive HTML tag and just add motion dot in front of it to tell React that you want this element to be treated as a div that or any element that can be animated. So what this animation basically is telling us is that the y value initially is set to 100, then you go to -10 and finally to 0. So it's just basically a spring-like animation. So if I refresh the page, you'll see that the thing just basically comes up and slides down a bit. Uh, Opacity is just how opaque an element is. So we set that from 0.5 to 1, basically fading it in. So these class names are part of Tailwind CSS. You can see we have some properties set. We have set display to flex, flex direction to column. We have set a padding, margin. We set a max width and so on. So the very basic display of whatever we get from the user authentication is we display an avatar, which is a component that we get from Material UI again. So what this takes is a width and a height, as well as a source for whatever we want to display. Um, Following that, we have a few other properties that we display using JavaScript inside JSX elements. So anything between the curly brackets is treated as JavaScript. So we are displaying the display name of the user. We're displaying the email and the UID, for example. So now let's look at how we can integrate whatever we had done from the last session. So basically the custom card we created, how we can put it in our new app. So to do that, what we can do is basically just create a new file, call it customcard.js. And what we can do is we can just get the code from the previous we can get the previous session's code and edit it to work with our new values. So if I head over to components and customcard.js, yep. So what we have defined here in the custom card is pretty similar to whatever we did last time. So in the last session, we had defined a custom card that was using the Material UI card component. It basically had three main sections. So there was a card header, there was card media, which is the image, card content, which was actually whatever is the title of your card, and there were card actions, which were basically the three buttons on the bottom. So now if you want to actually use this custom card in your index page, all you'll have to do is head over to the end of your file. So before the closing div, you can simply call custom card. The way you import it is something like this. So you're saying traverse the directory, just go one directory up, go into the components folder and get the custom card from there. So now if you head back to the local host, you can see that the card is printed out. We had implemented this last time. Now what we can do is, since we have the extra information like the person's name and the email ID, instead of having these values to be static or like hard coded from before, we can actually pass in the values we get from the user. So what we can do is in custom card, we can tell React that we are expecting certain values. How we can do that is in the function arguments. You can basically tell React that you are expecting something called say username. You want the email, and say you want the photo URL, and finally you would want, I think that's it. Yeah, so you get the username, email, and photo URL, for example. So how you can pass that over from the index.js file is very similar to how you would set an attribute on an HTML component. So what you can do is we defined it as username. So you can say username equals, and you can basically pass user dot display name, which is the default value for the display name of the user. Next, you can pass in the email by doing something like user dot email, and we are also passing in the photo URL. So we can just call user dot photo URL. So what this user is basically, again, the user, we are getting the value from the use auth state hook. If you actually want to see what this user value is, we can do that by calling use effect. So use effect. So what use effect is one of the primitive React hooks that React provides us with. Uh, So as I discussed before, it takes a dependency array and a function. So there are two main arguments that use effect takes. The first one is the function that needs to be run every time, and the second one is a dependency array. So whenever you keep this array empty, React only runs this use effect the first time your app is loaded on the screen. So now let's just So instead of running it only once, we can do something like user over here. So every time the user's value changes, this use effects function is run. So what we can do inside the use effect function is something very simple like console.log, and we can basically just log the user to see what the user has within it. So you wouldn't you wouldn't see anything change on the face value, but if you inspect element, and if you head over to your console, and if you refresh, you should basically see a user value being printed out over here. So let me zoom in a bit. Yep. So what it basically has is few of the things that we already use. So display name is whatever the user's display name is. In my case, it's just my name. Email is whatever email was used from the Google account that was used to sign in. Email verified with Google accounts is always set to true, so that isn't very helpful for us. And photo URL is basically an image file that the Google account is linked with. So if I visit the URL, yep, it basically is that photo. I don't know why it's not rendering on the avatar over here. Okay, let's check it out. So in our index.js file, we are basically rendering out the photo URL. Yeah, that should have worked. Oh, there you go. So it renders out the picture over here. So now we have already passed in all these values to our custom card. So we have said our username is this, email is that, and photo URL as user.photo URL. And we have already told our custom card component that is expecting these three values. So now what you can do is go ahead and edit out our static values with the dynamic values that we are getting. So for example, uh, in this avatar, instead of the source being set to a fixed value, we can basically go ahead and remove that, and we can replace that with photo URL. Also over here, instead of the width being fixed to 96, we can change the width to be, for example, 50%. Our card looks a bit bigger. And now we can also change other values that were previously statically typed. So for example, over here, we had set the title to example name. But since we actually have the name passed on to us in the component, we can simply replace that with username. And what that should do for us is it changes the card's title to my actual name over here. Now subheader over here, initially we were planning on the time, but for now, let's just replace that with an email. What that should do is replace this value with an email. Again, now in the card media, let's just keep the card media as it is. Yep. Rest of the code remains the same. So what we have basically done is we are getting the user's value from the authentication hook. And once the user is authenticated, the user's variable gets populated with the actual values, and those values are then being passed on to our custom React component that we made, and that's finally rendered onto our screen. So now let's just try to add a few more material UI components to make our app look more like a social media app, for example. So if you head over to mui.com and if you head over to the docs for material UI, on the left in the components tab, you can basically see we have a lot of components that you can choose from. So one of the basic ones we'll need is app bar, for example. So app bar is something that goes on the top of your app. You can see that we provided you with certain examples over here. So for example, if you want this app bar with a responsive menu, you can just click on the source code over here, and it should give you all the code necessary for adding this app bar to your own app. So what you can do is just copy the code, head back to your components directory, and you can click and create a new file. So let's name our file responsive app bar.js and just use their code for now. So it's exporting something called a responsive app bar. So how do you use that in your app? So what you could do is at the very start of your div, right after your div, you can just import the responsive app bar component. And what that should do here, okay, there is some error. There's some error in the code we just copy pasted. Let's just have a look at what's wrong. Okay, so basically what happened here is there are two variations of code. So one is in JavaScript and one is in TypeScript. So I accidentally copied the TypeScript code, which is why I was giving errors. Since I'm writing this in pure JavaScript, I would select the JS option over here, copy the code again, replace it. And what that should do is should create an app bar for us. Now, if you see the app bar, it doesn't stick when you scroll. So basically, it gets hidden when you scroll. How you can fix that is by going to your app bar's position property, and instead of static, if you hover over position, it should give you options that you can actually use for that particular property. So there are a few. There's fixed, there is static, there is absolute, there is sticky, which is what we would want to use. So what a sticky app bar is basically it will stay on the position, and once we scroll, it will not scroll with the page and basically stick to the top of the page. uh, Now we don't need this extra card that we made that displays the name, email, and user ID anymore. So what we can do is simply just head over to index.js, uh, remove this component altogether because we don't need it anymore. So you can remove the user information function as well. Yep. And what that does is it brings the app bar along with a custom card component over here. So now the problem with this approach, you just added a responsive app bar, but the problem here is it will only be rendered when someone is on the index page. What if you wanted to make this app bar rendered throughout your app? That's something you would usually want to do, right? You would not want the app bar just to be rendered on a single page. You would want it to be rendered throughout your app. So how you can do that is you can head over to your underscore app.js page. So underscore app.js page is basically uh, somewhere you can define layouts for your app. So what a layout is basically you can tell that render particular parts of your app throughout your app. So how I can fix that is over here before the component. So this component in your underscore app.js is whatever gets rendered inside your pages. So before the page even renders, I would want to render out my responsive app bar. So now if you head over back, you can see that the header still gets rendered out. But what's the advantage over here is, okay, let me just create an extra page, for example. So new file. Okay, so even without creating a page, I can just show you. If I log out from Google, you can see the app bar is still present, which is not really ideal. You wouldn't want your app bar to be shown on the sign-in page. So how you can fix that again is using your router custom hook that we import from next/link or next/router. So what you can do is conditionally render the app bar. So what you can tell React or Next.js basically is that if your router dot query or router dot path name, which is basically what the name of your current URL is. So if it is not equal to slash login, only then render this responsive app bar out. Otherwise, don't render it. Yep. So in our app bar, so now as you can see in your default login page, you can't see the app bar, but once you sign in with Google and once you complete the sign in flow, it should then render out the app bar on the top. Okay, so next, let's just edit out the responsive app bar to look more like something what we would want it to look like. So instead of the logo text over there, we can just put GDSC, for example. Now we don't really need all these extra buttons. So we could just head over to that part in the app and remove the extra buttons. So for example, here, just remove that. That should get rid of that. Wait one sec. Okay, yeah. So they basically have defined two layouts, one for a mobile phone and one for a wider screen. So you will have to edit both of them in order to get rid of the buttons. And yeah, you have a basic nav bar in your app. In a similar way, if you want to add a bottom navigation bar, Material UI has a component for that as well. So you can head over to bottom navigation. You can see they have a basic example over here, or one that just shows the icon and hides the label unless it's selected. So you can just click on view source, copy it, and then we can, in a similar way, we can just create a new component. So just create a new file, call it bottom navbar.js, and you can just paste the code from here. So yeah, as you can see over here, they have named their default component label bottom navigation. We'll just rename it to bottom navigation. So what that should do for us, in a similar way, we can just go to our underscore app.js, since our bottom nav bar will be a constant thing across pages. What we can do is can just say if router.path name is not equal to login. Basically, if you're not on the login page, you can render out the bottom nav bar. So you can say bottom navigation. So I can't name it bottom navigation because bottom navigation is a default Material UI function. So it kind of gets confused. So instead you can just call it bottom nav bar, for example. And in your app.js, just call it bottom nav bar. You have to even edit the import statement because it still says bottom navigation over here. So you can just edit that out. And now hopefully it should render out a bottom nav bar. it does render it out, but it's not really formatted in any way. So how we can fix that is basically just wrapping it around in a paper component. So Material UI has a component called paper. Paper is basically any sort of surface you want to use. So you can just do import paper from Material UI, and you can use this paper to basically wrap your bottom nav bar around with. So you can take the paper and wrap your bottom nav bar around with it. Uh, and now this paper, you can set certain properties, like you can say uh, you want its width to be of the entire screen, for example. Uh, you want it to be of a fixed position. You want the bottom of the thing to be 0 pixels from the bottom. So that didn't really work. You have to tell. Yeah. So now the bottom nav bar is stuck to the bottom, but it's still not exactly how we want it. We want it centered. How you could do that is you can add a flex property, and you can say uh, items center and align justify content center. So these are basically using Tailwind CSS's classes. They make writing styles simpler for you. So what this class name basically means is we are setting the width of the paper to the entire screen. So 100 VW. VW stands for the viewport width. We are setting the nav bar to be in a fixed position with the bottom of the nav bar 0 pixels to the bottom of your page. Uh, we are setting a flex property, and we are centering the items. So if that was right, yep, there you go. Your bottom nav bar just got centered. So now if you wanted to add multiple cards over here instead of a single card, you can do that as well. So in your index.js file, instead of using a single card over here, um, you can basically just define an array of what. Okay, so the image rendered out over there is using something called Unsplash. So Unsplash is like a is a platform where you can find images. So if you check out the custom card.js file, you can see that it uses the Unsplash's random API and basically tells that you want a 720p image of a particular topic, for example, here it's scenery. So what we can do is, instead of having this render out the same image every time, if you want, say for example, just say different animals to be rendered out, for example. So what you can do is you can head over to your index.js file. You can create posts array, for example, and uh, you can have different animals, for example, cat, dog, etc. Just for an example. So you have 3 different categories you want the card to be rendered out with. So how you can loop over this array is basically you can have a post.map method. So it will return you a post every time it loops over it. And inside this, you can basically return a JSX element. So in our case, we want a card to be rendered out for of each of the different categories. So you can just return like so. I think you have to. Think you have to wrap it around with curly braces and get rid of the round ones. Yep. Yeah, so far we just created a posts array and mapped each post to a particular custom card. So you can see it has printed multiple custom cards over here, but it's still not based on the topic we want the image to be rendered out for. So how you can fix that is you can uh, send uh, another prop to your component. So you can call it image category, for example, and you can just pass over your post into this custom image category. Uh, now, with React, when you have things that you render out in loops, there is something that's important that's called a key, which helps React keep track of which element is having a particular key, so it doesn't have to re-render all the elements every time. So now that we have passed the image category to our custom component, we can head over to the custom card.js file. We can tell React that we are expecting another prop, that is image category. And inside the image over here, instead of having a static link over here, what you could use is make the use of template literals. So what a template literal is a string basically within which you can use JavaScript. So for example, instead of a scenery over here, you can replace that with something like dollar and the curly braces, and inside the curly braces whatever you write is passed as a JavaScript object, and whatever the JavaScript object returns is used as part of the whole string. So over here, since we are getting the image category, we can just specify that we want an image of this particular category. So what that should have done is it edits out the images and you have custom images based on the category. um, yep, so as you can see, the last post is sort of has doesn't respect the bottom navbar and it doesn't give enough spacing for it. How you can fix it is pretty simple. You can head over here in the underscore app.js file, and you can just add a div, for example. So inside the div, you can just keep it an empty div, and you can just say that the height of the div you want it to be, say, 32, for example. What that should do is just add extra spacing at the bottom so it doesn't look like they're colliding, basically. Yep, so that's pretty much it for today. Uh, so we basically went over how Firebase authentication works. The authentication is, it doesn't, the good thing about Firebase authentication is it's persistent, which means that even if you reload the page or if the user visits the same page later, uh, it remembers that the user had signed in and it automatically signs in the user. We even saw how we could use React Firebase hooks to make the sign-in process even easier. And uh, we even saw an example with different post categories and how our custom card could be used to basically render out the same component but with different values. Uh, and yeah, that's pretty much it. For the next session, we'll be covering more about the React, more about Firestore's Cloud Firestore database. So we'll be linking our app with an actual backend, and we'll be creating components that can upload um, posts to this simple social media application. We'll be looking at different routes. So we'll be creating extra routes for like the user's profile page, for example, the feed page, an explore page that has common posts. Uh, yeah, and we'll be actually deploying the app as well. In the next session, we'll be using Vercel, which is the creator of Next.js, and we'll be using their platform to deploy our app so that anyone with a link can actually visit the website. Uh, yeah, I'll be making this code public. It will be available on the Tech Club repository on GitHub. Uh, and yeah, that'll be a wrap from my side. I'd like to thank everyone for attending the session online as well as in person. Um, if you have any doubts, any questions, you can ask me right now. I'm open for questions. Uh, yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you. So I don't think there are any questions in the chat. So this is GDSC at Heriot-Watt University. Thank you for joining us. See you in the next session.